I first heard whispers about the peculiar Dia de los Muertos celebration while sipping coffee in the town's single, modest cafe. Stories drifted from nearby tables, weaving tales of midnight gatherings, the echo of ancient songs, and shadowed figures that appeared only for this annual event. I had been living in this small town for only a few months, drawn to its quiet, sun-washed streets and distant mountains. But, as November neared, the air itself seemed to buzz with an unfamiliar tension. I wondered if I was simply imagining it, though in my mind, the stories seemed to gather weight, pressing down until I could hardly ignore them. When the day finally arrived, I decided to join the townsfolk in the square. They'd spent weeks preparing, decorating tables with flowers, setting up small shrines with flickering candles, and arranging skeletons in various poses. Families set up portraits of their loved ones, faces framed by marigolds, their gazes steady and unblinking. As dusk crept across the square, a small group of strangers arrived, almost drifting into view. They were unfamiliar faces, dressed in clothing that seemed both elaborate and, strangely, ancient. The mother, I assumed, wore a gown with dark, layered fabrics that shimmered in the candlelight. Beside her stood a tall man with sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to watch everyone without actually looking at anyone. Two children completed the group, a young boy with an expression far too serious for his age and a girl who giggled quietly to herself, seemingly delighted by the ceremony. The townsfolk, usually polite, fell silent as they noticed this new family. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, eyes narrowing in curiosity or suspicion. Despite my curiosity, I kept my distance, sensing an unspoken rule against approaching them too soon. Instead, I stood near one of the altars, pretending to be absorbed in the offerings and candles but glancing back, my gaze tracing their every movement. The family moved through the square with a curious grace, almost as if they were gliding rather than walking. When they reached the center, the woman, the mother, spoke in a voice both soft and commanding. She told us that they were here to honor their ancestors, the oldest of souls who had walked this land long before we were born. Her words captivated us, her tales of those ancient spirits seeming to weave a spell over the gathering. And then they began to dance. The children moved first, delicate and swift, their limbs moving in patterns that felt achingly familiar, as though they echoed rhythms from long ago. The father joined in with slower, solemn steps, and the mother followed, her dress swirling around her like waves. The townsfolk watched, spellbound, unable to turn away from the sight of this family moving as if they were part of a forgotten ritual. For a moment, time seemed to halt, and the air grew cold, heavy with something unseen yet unmistakably present. The dance quickened, and a low hum emerged from their throats, building into a melody so haunting that my skin prickled with a chill. I couldn't shake the sense that they were here for something more than just honoring the dead. Then, as suddenly as it began, the dance stopped. The family stood still, their breaths visible in the cold night air, gazing around as if searching for something or someone. Their eyes landed on a few of us in the crowd, lingering just long enough to send an uneasy shiver down my spine. But before I could think or move, they turned, slipping away into the shadows as the crowd stirred back to life, breaking the spell that had bound us all. When I finally gathered the courage to ask one of the locals about the mysterious family, the response was a mix of discomfort and evasion. No one seemed to know who they were, only that they had vanished as quietly as they had arrived. But as I left the square that night, the haunting dance replaying in my mind, I knew one thing: they would return, just as they always did. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered in the wake of that night's celebration. Life in the town resumed its usual, slow pace, but those of us who had witnessed the family's dance seemed changed, if only in the way we glanced over our shoulders or drifted into uneasy silence. The square itself, now stripped of the altars and flowers, held an odd chill in the air, as if the festivities had left an imprint that wouldn't easily fade. My own thoughts circled back to the family. Each time I closed my eyes, I could see the mother's gaze, unsettlingly intent, as if searching for something beneath my skin. There was something distinctly haunting in her presence, her piercing stare and the strange, old-fashioned way she'd spoken. I had half a mind to ask someone in town if they'd seen them again, but I quickly dismissed the idea. No one seemed eager to discuss that night. One afternoon, in a fit of restless curiosity, I walked back to the square. It was empty now, save for a scattering of fallen leaves, but a familiar unease crept over me as I approached. Something lay on the ground where they had danced, a small charm, barely visible beneath the dirt. It was a strange, intricate piece made from dark, twisted metal and shaped like a tiny, hollowed-out face. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if one of the family had dropped it intentionally, leaving behind a silent invitation to what, exactly? Against my better judgment, I slipped the charm into my pocket, feeling its cold weight press against me as I made my way home. That night, I placed it on my dresser, but its presence gnawed at me, filling the room with an almost unbearable tension. I lay awake, staring at it in the dark, and felt a peculiar weight on my chest, as though I wasn't alone in my room. When sleep finally came, it was fitful and thick with uneasy dreams. I wandered through empty streets, hearing faint whispers and footsteps that seemed to echo from all directions, though no one was there. The faces of the townspeople appeared and vanished, their expressions blank, as though they'd been drained of any recognition. But worst of all, I saw the family. They were standing together at the far end of the square, watching me with that same unnerving intensity. The children's faces were pale, their eyes wide and dark, as if they could see straight through me. I woke with a start, the charm cold against my fingers, and nearly leapt out of bed, realizing I'd been clutching it in my sleep. There was something unearthly about it, something that called to me even as I wanted to be rid of it. The sensation of being watched clung to me throughout the morning, lingering even as I left my home and joined the quiet flow of the town's daily life. At the cafe, I ordered my coffee and sank into my usual corner, hoping to shake off the disquiet that clung to me. A few of the regulars were chatting in low voices at a nearby table, and I strained to hear, hoping for a mention of the strange family. But the conversation was vague, hinting at the mysterious visitors without naming them, as though they were afraid to acknowledge what they'd seen. As I sipped my coffee, my mind drifted, catching hold of a thought that made me pause. What if they hadn't left at all? The idea was absurd, but I couldn't dismiss it entirely. Their faces, their eerie dance, the way they'd seemed to melt into the shadows, I had the feeling they hadn't vanished, but had merely slipped into some hidden corner of the town, waiting. That evening, as I walked home through the twilight, I felt an odd certainty settle over me. I was being watched. I quickened my pace, but every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every gust of wind whispered my name. By the time I reached my door, I was nearly breathless, half convinced that one of them was right behind me, ready to lay a hand on my shoulder. Inside, I locked the door and stood still, listening to the silence. My house felt different, its familiar rooms now unfamiliar, holding a strange, oppressive silence. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a lingering unease from the festival, and yet I couldn't ignore the feeling that something, or someone, had followed me home. That night, sleep evaded me entirely. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows seemed amplified, as though my house had taken on a life of its own, murmuring secrets it wanted me to hear. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, as images from the festival crowded into my mind, their faces, the haunting rhythm of their dance, and the way their voices had woven into a strange, eerie melody. At some point, I must have drifted off, for I found myself in a dream, standing in the square. It was dark, and the only light came from a faint glow emanating from the small charm I'd found. I clutched it in my hand, feeling its cold surface pulse gently against my skin, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. All around me, shadows gathered, shifting and swaying as though they were dancing in silence. I knew, with that strange certainty that only exists in dreams, that they were waiting for me. The family appeared, emerging one by one from the shadows. The mother stood closest, her gaze fixed on me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was neither welcoming nor hostile, but carried a sense of expectation, as though she'd been waiting a very long time. The children stood beside her, their faces blank and eerily calm, while the father watched from the edge of the circle, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "Why did you take it?" the mother asked, her voice soft but firm, as though reprimanding a child. I tried to respond, but my voice wouldn't come. The charm in my hand felt heavier, almost too heavy to hold, yet I couldn't bring myself to release it. There was a sense of dread building in me, a feeling that I had crossed an invisible line, that I had taken something that was never meant for me. "You brought it home," she continued, her tone almost accusatory. "You kept it." The family began to move again, slowly circling me as they had in their dance. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, as though I were standing on something fragile that might give way at any moment. The children's footsteps were nearly soundless, their movements so fluid they seemed to be floating. As they circled, the father began to hum, a low, haunting sound that sent a shiver down my spine. The others joined in, their voices weaving together in a mournful, ancient tune that grew louder with each repetition. The words were foreign, but the tone carried a sense of longing, of something reaching across an impossible distance. And then, as if they had completed some ritual, they stopped. The mother looked at me, her expression softening into something like pity. "You belong to us now," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You opened the door." I woke with a jolt, drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The familiar shapes of my room seemed distorted, cloaked in shadows that felt somehow alive. The charm lay on my nightstand, gleaming faintly in the dim light. I reached for it, half-dazed, but stopped myself, recoiling from the cold, metallic glint. The memory of her words echoed in my mind, "You opened the door." The next day, I could hardly bring myself to leave the house, but the silence within its walls was unbearable. I needed air, a sense of normalcy, anything to shake off the feeling that clung to me like a shadow. I stepped outside, grateful for the daylight, though the town seemed strangely subdued. The streets were almost empty, as though everyone had collectively decided to stay indoors. I walked aimlessly, hoping the chill of the air might clear my mind. But as I passed the square, a strange sight caught my attention, a small altar, hidden in a shadowed corner, one that hadn't been there the night before. It was simple, just a rough stone slab with a few scattered flowers, but there was a familiarity to it that made my stomach twist. On the altar lay another charm, identical to the one I had found, positioned as if waiting for someone to claim it. And beside it was a note, scrawled in faded, trembling letters, "They come for those who take what belongs to them." A creeping dread washed over me, a certainty that this was no ordinary celebration. Whatever forces we had gathered to honor that night had not returned to their world entirely. They lingered, watching, waiting, and perhaps even recruiting. I turned, eager to leave, but the weight of the charm in my pocket seemed to tug at me, as though it were trying to draw me back to that small, unmarked altar. As I walked away, I felt the faintest echo of their melody drifting through the square, barely audible but impossible to ignore, like a whisper in the back of my mind. It wasn't over. Whatever I'd encountered that night had followed me, threading itself into my life, and I was no longer certain I could ever escape. In the days that followed, I found myself retreating from the town, from familiar faces and places, as though distancing myself might shake off the unsettling feeling that clung to me. I tried to live as I had before, filling my days with small tasks and empty conversations. But nothing seemed to dull the sharp, persistent sensation of being watched. Every night, I returned to the same uneasy sleep, haunted by the echoes of that strange family and their quiet, measured gazes. On the fifth night, I dreamed again of the square. Only this time, it was covered in a dense, eerie fog that seemed to obscure everything beyond a few feet in front of me. I could see shadows shifting in the mist, faint figures moving in the distance, but they stayed just beyond my reach. The charm was in my hand once more, heavier than before, and its cool, metallic surface pulsed with a faint warmth, as if it had a life of its own. As I walked forward, the fog parted, and the family appeared again, exactly as they had the night of the celebration. They stood in a circle, waiting, and their faces were no longer blank. Each of them looked at me with the same knowing expression, as though they were privy to a secret I could never fully understand. "Why do you run from us?" the mother asked, her voice as soft as the fog swirling around us. I wanted to answer, to tell her that I hadn't asked for this, that I didn't understand what they wanted, but the words were trapped in my throat. Instead, I took a step back, but the father's voice stopped me. "You belong here," he said, his eyes glinting with a strange intensity. "You accepted the gift, and with it, you accepted us." I clutched the charm, feeling it grow warmer in my hand, and something in me cracked. I didn't want any of this. I cried, my voice echoing through the mist. The mother tilted her head, a slight smile playing on her lips. "But it's too late now. The charm binds you to us, to the old ways. You opened the door, and we've come through." At that, the mist thickened, and the world around me began to spin. The ground felt unsteady beneath my feet, as though I were standing on the edge of something vast and unseen. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the family faded, melting back into the fog. But their voices lingered, weaving together in that haunting, familiar melody. It seeped into my bones, filling me with a strange, heavy dread. I woke with a gasp, my hands clutching the empty space where the charm should have been. But it was gone, as if it had vanished into the air. In its place was a thin layer of fine, white dust on my nightstand, a remnant, perhaps, of whatever ritual had bound me to them. Sleep became a rare thing after that night, each time punctuated by dreams that felt less like dreams and more like visitations. I began to dread the moments between waking and sleeping, the thin veil that separated me from whatever lay on the other side. During the day, I moved through town as though in a trance, hearing their voices in every rustling leaf, every distant footstep. It was in this state of dread and exhaustion that I began to notice others around me, people in the town who had been present at the festival, acting strangely. They, too, seemed haunted, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes darting around as though they sensed something unseen. I realized then that I wasn't alone in this burden. Others had been marked, chosen in the same silent, inexorable way. One afternoon, I caught sight of a neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, a woman who had lived in town for decades, standing at her gate, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the hills. Her face was blank, expressionless, and as I passed, she didn't so much as blink, as if she were caught in a trance. I wanted to call her name, to break the silence that clung to us both, but something held me back, a primal instinct warning me that I shouldn't interfere. By the time I reached home, the sun was setting, casting a long shadow across the square. I felt a sudden urge to return there, as though some invisible thread were pulling me back. And so, I went, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, until I stood once more in the center of the square, surrounded by the fading light. There, waiting in the shadows, I saw them again, the family, standing exactly as they had in my dream. They were silent, their faces hidden in the dimness, but I felt their eyes on me, watching, waiting. And then, without a word, the mother extended her hand, as though inviting me to join them. A shiver ran through me, and I felt the weight of my own heartbeat echo in my chest. I took a step forward, compelled by a force I couldn't resist, and in that moment, I understood the charm had not bound me to them. I had bound myself, in 1,000 small ways, by my curiosity, by my fear, by the simple act of stepping into their circle that night. As I stood before them, I felt the world shift, the ground beneath me slipping into something darker, older. I knew then that there was no escaping, that I had crossed into their realm and could not return to my own. Their melody filled the air, wrapping around me like a shroud, and I felt myself sinking into it, becoming a part of their ancient song. The air was thick with silence. As I looked around the square, I noticed for the first time how the buildings seemed to lean inward, looming over me with a quiet menace. Their windows, usually so benign, seemed like eyes watching from every angle, their reflections twisted in the twilight. Shadows spilled out onto the cobblestones, dark tendrils creeping toward me, and I felt the weight of the night pressing down. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, caught between the world I knew and the unknown before me. The family watched me, their figures still and waiting, as if they were carved from stone. I had the sudden urge to run, to flee back to the familiarity of my small home, to lock the door and shut out the strange faces and eerie melodies. But some force held me there, rooted to the spot, as though the square itself had wrapped its cold fingers around my ankles. Slowly, the father moved forward, his face still obscured in shadow, his steps as soft as whispers. He extended his hand, palm up, and in his grasp was the charm, the small piece of metal that had haunted me for days. I couldn't understand how it had returned to him, how it had traveled from my room to his hand as if by some invisible thread. His voice was barely a murmur, low and calm. "You left something with us," he said. His words drifted toward me like smoke, and despite the chill in the air, I felt a feverish warmth coil through me. I forced myself to look into his eyes. They held a sadness I hadn't seen before, a depth that seemed to stretch back through generations. There was something deeply familiar in his gaze, a strange echo of faces I thought I knew, though I couldn't place them. "Why did you come here?" I asked, surprised at the tremor in my own voice. "What do you want from us?" The father didn't answer. Instead, he held the charm toward me, urging me to take it. I wanted to refuse, to turn away, but the same force that had drawn me to the square now guided my hand toward his. My fingers closed around the cold metal, and I felt a sharp, electric jolt shoot through my arm, as if the charm itself were alive, pulsing with an energy beyond anything I could understand. When I looked down, the charm seemed to shimmer in the fading light, its surface etched with delicate, twisting patterns I hadn't noticed before. They seemed to move, shifting in and out of focus, as though the charm were whispering secrets only I could hear. "You're one of us now," the father said softly. "It's time for you to remember." "Remember?" I echoed, my mind spinning. I couldn't understand what he meant, but something in his words resonated deep within me, tugging at memories I couldn't fully grasp. The mother stepped forward, joining her husband, and placed her hand on my shoulder. Her touch was unexpectedly warm, and I felt an unsettling comfort in her presence, as though she were a familiar figure from some forgotten part of my life. "Our story has been told through countless ages," she whispered, her voice lilting like a lullaby. "Every year, we return to find those who are meant to join us, to continue the legacy." I wanted to pull away, to shake off their strange words, but their voices wrapped around me, gentle and insistent. The square seemed to shrink, pressing us together, sealing me in a cocoon of memories I couldn't yet name. "We don't recruit," she continued. "We only remind. Those who are meant to find us always do." The wind picked up, swirling leaves around our feet, and in that moment, I felt something stir within me, a faint flicker of recognition, a thread connecting me to this family, this night, in ways I couldn't explain. Flashes of images flickered through my mind, glimpses of faces I didn't recognize but somehow felt I'd known all my life, of voices whispering secrets I'd long forgotten. I looked down at the charm, and it pulsed in my hand, beating in time with my heart. The patterns on its surface seemed clearer now, as though they were revealing themselves to me, each line a fragment of a story I was only beginning to understand. "You were always meant to be here," the mother said, her voice soft and steady. "You have always been one of us." A chill ran through me, not from fear, but from a strange, unearthly calm that settled over me. In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The charm was mine, and with it came a bond one could no longer deny. The family's faces softened, their eyes filled with a quiet acceptance, and I felt my own resistance dissolve, replaced by a deep, unsettling understanding. They stepped back, retreating into the shadows, and I knew they were leaving me with a choice, a final decision that would forever bind me to them, or set me free. I clutched the charm, feeling its weight, and knew that whatever path I chose, nothing would ever be the same. The square was silent once more, and as the darkness closed in around me, I was left with the haunting certainty that I had crossed a threshold, one I could never fully return from. The days that followed were drenched in an eerie calm, a quiet that seemed unnatural in our usually bustling town. No one spoke of the celebration, or of the strange family that had seemed to vanish as silently as they'd arrived. The townsfolk moved about with uneasy glances, as if we were all dancing around an unspoken truth that simmered just below the surface. It felt as though an invisible thread now connected us, an unbreakable bond tying each of us to that night. And the charm, its presence was unavoidable. I kept it in my pocket, its weight both comforting and disquieting, as if it were holding secrets I wasn't ready to hear. Every so often, I'd find myself holding it, my fingers tracing the delicate patterns engraved into its surface. Each swirl and curve seemed to pulse under my touch, alive with a quiet energy, and when I closed my eyes, I could almost hear faint whispers, voices curling like mist in the back of my mind. I began to wonder if anyone else could feel it. Were they haunted by the charm's presence, as I was? Did they too feel the pull, as though some hidden part of us had been unearthed that night? Each time I tried to bring it up in conversation, a wall would rise, a silence that was as thick as stone. People changed the subject, their faces growing pale, as if just the thought was enough to disturb something deep within them. Then, one night, I found myself wandering back to the town square. I couldn't resist the pull any longer, the way it tugged at me with an insistent, quiet persistence. The square was empty, bathed in the silvery glow of the moon, and shadows stretched across the cobblestones like fingers reaching out to grasp whatever passed by. There was no sign of the family. Yet as I stood there, I felt them. Not as figures or shapes, but as an energy, a watchful presence that seemed to hover just beyond sight. I clutched the charm, my fingers wrapped tightly around it, and felt a warmth seep into my palm, a strange, unearthly warmth that spread through me, filling me with a mix of dread and comfort. In the silence, the whispers began again, faint at first, then slowly rising, swirling around me like a dark lullaby. They were voices both familiar and foreign, speaking in words I couldn't understand, yet somehow I knew they were speaking to me. I closed my eyes, letting the sounds wash over me, and in the darkness, a strange vision began to take shape. I saw the town, our small village with its narrow streets and crooked houses. But it was different, shrouded in an old-world mist, the kind that clings to history and memory. People moved through the streets, figures cloaked in shadows, their faces blurred but somehow achingly familiar. They were townsfolk from another time, people I felt I had always known yet couldn't name. And among them, the family moved like specters, their eyes glowing softly in the darkness as they weaved through the crowd, touching shoulders, whispering into ears. I watched as they beckoned, their hands outstretched, inviting others to join them in some timeless dance. The townsfolk didn't resist, they moved forward willingly, as if drawn by some ancient call, their faces serene and blank as they took the family's hands and faded into the shadows. The vision began to blur, the edges of my mind fraying, and I felt myself being pulled deeper into the scene, as though I were stepping into that mist-laden world, joining the silent procession of souls drifting toward the unknown. Suddenly, I snapped back to reality, the square looming around me, silent and empty. My hand was still clutching the charm, its warmth now gone, replaced by a cold, hollow weight that settled deep within me. I felt as though I had glimpsed something forbidden, a world that lay just beneath the surface of our own, waiting to claim those who dared to see it. As I stood there, trembling, I heard a faint rustling behind me. Turning, I saw nothing but shadows, shifting and stretching in the moonlight. Yet I could feel the family's presence, lingering, as if they were watching, waiting for the right moment to reappear. They hadn't left, I realized. They were simply hiding, woven into the fabric of the town itself, waiting for the next soul to join them. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When I finally closed my eyes, the vision returned, replaying itself in fragments, each piece more vivid and haunting than the last. The family's eyes, their hands reaching out, the faint echo of whispered words. And through it all, the quiet pull of the charm, tugging at me, urging me to remember, to understand what had been hidden from me all along. As dawn broke, I awoke with a newfound certainty, a dark realization that settled over me like a shroud. I was no longer just a visitor to their world. I had crossed a line, one that I could never uncross. The charm was no longer just an object, it was a bond, a promise, one that bound me to their world as surely as if I had joined them in that misty dance. I knew then that I couldn't escape. The family was here, always waiting, watching, their presence woven into the very bones of the town. And whether I wanted it or not, I was now a part of their story, bound to carry their legacy, to hold their secrets in the silence of the night. The days blurred together in a gray monotony after that night. People moved through the town square with a peculiar caution, as if they sensed something had shifted, something they couldn't quite name. Faces once familiar to me now seemed distant, almost foreign, and I became increasingly aware of how often people averted their eyes when we crossed paths. Whispers trailed behind me, never loud enough to understand, but unmistakably there, curling through the air like strands of smoke. It was late one evening when I finally decided to leave town. The charm weighed in my pocket as I packed my few belongings, its cold surface pressing against my thigh, a final reminder of the night that had changed everything. But as I stood at my door, suitcase in hand, something stopped me, a faint, almost imperceptible tug. It was the charm, urging me to look back one last time. Against my better judgment, I walked to the town square. It was empty, silent in a way that felt almost reverent, and the air was thick with a palpable anticipation. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stood there, the buildings looming around me like sentinels, and in that moment, I understood that I was being watched. Not by the usual passers-by or shopkeepers, but by something far older, something that had been waiting long before I arrived. I took the charm out of my pocket, holding it up to the faint moonlight, and as I stared into its intricate design, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. I could see the town as it once was, could feel the weight of all those who had come before me, who had once stood in this very square. The family's presence was everywhere, woven into the walls, etched into the cobblestones, lingering in the very air we breathed. They had been here for centuries, bound to this place by a promise, an unbreakable vow. And now, so was I. A shadow shifted near the edge of the square, and I felt my breath hitch as I saw them standing there, their faces half hidden in the dim light. The family. They watched me with eyes that glowed softly, their expressions serene, almost welcoming, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. They beckoned to me, their hands outstretched, inviting me to join them in the silent, timeless dance that bound them to this place. I took a step back, my heart pounding, but my feet seemed rooted to the ground, held in place by some unseen force. The charm grew warm in my hand, pulsing with an energy that seemed to sync with my heartbeat, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, as if the decision had already been made. In the silence, I could hear the faintest hint of music, a haunting melody that drifted through the air like a whisper. The family moved in time with it, their steps slow and deliberate, and as I watched, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. I realized, then, that I was no longer afraid. This was not an ending, but a continuation, a journey into something unknown, something I had always been meant to join. With a deep breath, I took a step forward, my hands still clutching the charm, and as I crossed the threshold, the town square seemed to shift, the world blurring around me as I entered their world. The family welcomed me with quiet smiles, their hands warm as they took mine, and together, we moved in time with the music, our steps light and weightless as we danced through the night. In that moment, I knew that I had become part of something far greater than myself, a legacy that would endure long after the world forgot our names. We would live on, bound to this place, watching over the town as silent guardians, unseen but ever present, our stories woven into the very fabric of its history. And as the night faded into dawn, I felt a deep sense of belonging, a quiet joy that filled me with a peace I had never known. I was home, at last, bound to the family and the town in a way that transcended time, a part of their story, a keeper of their secrets, forever.